Well, good morning, everybody from London, and good day wherever you are. Welcome to this DDEX webinar, which today is going to focus on the DDEX Data Dictionary. My name is Mark Isherwood, and along with Niels Romp, my colleague, and others, we form the Secretariat for DDEX. And during this webinar, I will provide a brief overview of DDEX. I'm sure most of you know now what DDEX is and what it does, and then introduce the subject of the data dictionary, focusing on the issues of semantics and syntax. And then Niels will talk a little bit more about other aspects of the data dictionary and why there are different editions of the dictionary within the DDEX ecosystem. As always, please do ask questions. We will try to keep an eye on the chat as you ask questions, so that we can hopefully inform you more about what you need to know. If you could please stay mute whilst we're presenting, so that there's no disturbance to other people, that would be appreciated. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the DDEX website in the next day or two. So, as I'm sure most of you now know, DDEX is a standards organization operating primarily in the music industry, and we develop standards to improve the efficiency of communication right along the value chain in the music industry. And we do this by creating standards in three sorts of areas. Firstly, and probably the area we're best known for, is we develop the messaging formats. And these message formats basically set out the order in which data has to be communicated to your business partners, what the relationships are between different data elements, and so on. These are what get exchanged between business partners, obviously with the data from each business partner populating the fields. The second element is the choreographies, and these basically set out the order in which messages should be exchanged between business partners, and may set out things like the trigger that requires or leads to the sending of a message, but that enables workflows to be very clear in terms of communications using computer messages. And then finally, we set out the protocols by which the messages actually get exchanged. Primarily, that is and has been throughout DDEX's time using secure FTP sites, but increasingly we are setting out web service protocols, which obviously leads to more automation and more efficiency in terms of the communication of messages. So those are the three formats, or the three types of standards that we create. And this diagram shows the number of different standards groups that we've got, families of standards. And as you can see, across all the different roles that exist within the industry, things are pretty comprehensive in terms of different types of messages for different business transaction purposes. That said, and hopefully this will come across as we dive more into the data dictionary, all of the standards are basically built from the same building blocks, and we will see some of that during the course of this webinar, so that although each set of messages is different from others, there are large chunks of them that are very much the same. They just may appear in different orders. For example, the release delivery message focuses very much on releases, so collections of sound recordings, whereas the repertoire data and rights standards focus very much on the sound recordings themselves, because for the music licensing companies, that is more important than the context in which each sound recording has been presented. So moving on, it is fair to say now that we consider DDEX to be ubiquitous. We've issued well over 6,500 implementation licenses. And although we don't have detailed information about those license or the actual implementations, we obviously know that they exist. So we can't actually count the actual implementations, but we do know that any company that's serious about operating in the music industry these days is using DDEX in one way or another. So let's now turn to look at the data dictionary itself. So all our messages are made up effectively of two things: the syntax, which is the structure of the text, which I mentioned earlier on in the context of the formats, and in some ways more importantly, the semantics, which is the actual meaning. And in many ways, the meaning of individual words is at the heart of DDEX, in that the industry has effectively agreed collectively that certain terms have certain meaning, and this ensures that even if those terms have different meanings within individual companies' systems, it is possible for business partners to map to the DDEX meaning and therefore understand what each is telling the other in terms of the data that's being exchanged. And here you see, focusing first on the syntax, how important all of these tags are that show the nature of the syntax within an XML message. And clearly, if you get it wrong, that's invalid syntactically, and so the message will be rejected because it doesn't meet the structure and the syntax that's been agreed. Most of DDEX's messages are defined in XML, which is what you can see there in the light blue color. And also in the case of the profiles within the ERN messages, ISO's, the International Standard Organization's schematron standard. So that is what we use. We've used XML from the very beginning. There are some of our messages and standards are actually use structured flat files, and the reason for that is that the nature of the data, usually sales and usage reports, which is very, very repetitive, doesn't sit very easily in XML structures. And so we've chosen to use structured flat files, which actually makes the whole process a lot more efficient. But primarily, we use XML to develop our messages. Having said all of that, the object of this is to get a computer to understand what is meant by text, the structure and the meaning, because for a computer it's just a series of characters. The XML tags have no inherent meaning of their own. So within the syntax, there are various elements which help decide what the meaning is in terms of the syntax. So what we define in the formats is where you're allowed to use certain tags with exact spellings, including capitalizations. There are also what we call cardinality, which tells you how many occurrences of a piece of data should appear in a message, and there are basically four. One is 0 to 1, which is optional or conditional. In other words, if a certain state exists, then you have to put data in there. That's the conditional. If that state doesn't exist, then it's optional to put that data in. 1 is obviously mandatory. You have to put the data in. And then you have 1 and 0 to many. Obviously 0 to many makes it optional. 1 to many means there's got to be something there, but there may be multiple examples of that type of data. The syntax also determines whether we're dealing with an element or an attribute about an element. And then we define the type of data that can be placed in the particular field, integers being numbers, strings just obviously a string of alphanumerics, decimals, dates, date time, composites, which Niels will talk about a bit more, and allowed value sets. So those are the sorts of things that appear within the syntax, and other rules like if this contains X, then that must contain Y within different fields in the relationships between them. So all of that syntax helps create the meaning that the computers can begin to understand. So I mentioned allowed values, which are a very significant part of DDEX. So I'm now going to hand over to Niels, who will talk to you about that and other aspects of the standards.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good morning, good afternoon, good day to you all. So Mark has briefly introduced semantics and syntax of standards and the importance of both in terms of messaging. One of the most crucial elements, I would think, is not just the syntax of what you communicate, but also the allowed value sets that you can use to express a specific subject. Some people call them code lists. We call them allowed value sets. It's basically a set of predefined terms for a specific tag. So use type, role code, territory code, and so forth. There are hundreds of these in the DDEX standards. They define and allow people to make their computers do specific action. For example, territory code is an obvious one. If I have a deal that needs to be communicated and that deal only applies to a specific territory, I need to be able to communicate that. Now, if I write into my message Germany and somebody else writes into their message Deutschland and someone else puts DE in there, someone puts in GER as the one that's usually used in sports, well, that's no good for a computer. For a human, that's fine. They might be able to discern those things. For computers, not so much. As with the tags themselves, they need to be a unique spelling for each semantic in this case, and therefore we define allowed value sets. Having said all of that, some of those allowed value sets also need to be user extensible. Use type is one of those examples. For example, we define a number of use types. Download, stream are the usual ones, but there are others. I guess we have about a good dozen or 2 dozen of those. But the music industry is developing, and therefore there is need to be able to accommodate usages that are not yet thought of while we made the standard. So users can actually bilaterally agree a specific string with a specific semantics and then communicate that in their message as a user-defined value. But I don't think I can overemphasize enough the value and the importance of these allowed values for the automated processing of the data that is being conveyed in DDEX messages. One of the things that we do, and territory code is one of those examples, wherever possible, we import existing code lists. So territories, countries, currencies, the ISO standards organization, they have defined a list of territories, for example, And in this case, DE is the code for Germany, and US is the code for the United States, and TH is the code for Thailand, and so forth. So we simply use them. And whenever the ISO standard is changed, we will follow suit and just do the same change. But obviously, role codes, use types, those are there are no other standards bodies that define these sets of values, and therefore DDEX maintains them and constantly updates them and manages them. Looking at the data a little bit more specifically, the syntax, there are two views that DDEX offers on that. The first is what I would call the XSD view, and it's simply if you take the XML schema definition that defines each standard, and in this case I've just opened the ERN standards XML schema definition file, XSD file, and then you can look at it typically in a graphical way, and there you see a typical view, in this case, of the contributor composite. Composite, as Mark has said, is just a collection of data, of individual data elements. And in this case, you can see from the diagram, and I've spelled it out on the left-hand side as well, that this composite contains an attribute, it then contains a sequence of individual tags, contributor party reference, role, instrument type, and so forth. And you can also see that you have all those cardinalities spelled out there. So contributor party reference, by virtue of that fat line, it's a mandatory element. The role code, by virtue of the thin line, it's optional. And then you see the naught dot dot and then the infinity symbol. That means it's naught to n role codes that you communicate. But we're not here to talk about the XSD view. We're here to talk about the data dictionary itself today. And this is how the same thing looks on the data dictionary. And it looks a little bit frightening when you looking at it for the first time. But if you take away some of the information, you realize that it actually just gives you the view of the syntax. The same information that you've just seen in the diagram, you find here in a tabular way. So the ERN contributor composite contains a sequence number attribute. That's the thing that I didn't show you on the previous one. And then a sequence of composites and elements that sit underneath. Contributor party reference, role, instrument type, and so forth. And further on the right-hand side, you see the cardinality. So it's basically the same information, isn't it? The cool thing here, and that is what the XSD view can't really give you that easily, is that all the little bits and bobs that are in blue are actually hyperlinks. And they allow you to traverse the full, in this case, ERN data dictionary. So of course you have the alpha index at the top, where you can see where you can jump to an element that starts with the letter K and the like. But you can also click on, for example, display credits. And if you do that, you just jump to the same page, same style of page, but now for the display credits composite. And again, you have lots of hyperlinks, and you again have the structural information that we just talked about. So display credits itself has three attributes: the language and script code, applicable territory code, and a flag called is default, and then a sequence of elements, display credit text, and then it has even a sequence of sequences of display credit party and name used in display credit. DDEX uses sometimes rather long terms and tags in their messages to be rather expressive, but that helps you to read the messages for humans, for example. And again, you have the cardinality and you have the data type. But obviously, as you can see from all those gray boxes here, there is more information on the data dictionary. The first is that it actually shows you where something is being used. So the display credits is used in the ERN standard, not only in the contributor composite, that's where we've just been, but also in the detailed resource contributor, in the sound recording, and in the video composite. And again, you can see what the cardinality of the display credits in those other 4 composites would be. It's 0 to n in all 4 cases. And it's always called display credit. Sometimes actually the tag name in a message is different from the name of the composite itself. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But there is more on this page, obviously. The first thing is, Massimo just asked whether I'll post a link to the data dictionary. I will most certainly show you at the very end where you can get to the data dictionary. Absolutely, yes. So at the very top of this page, you see not only the name of the composite, so the display credits in this case, and the DDEX C in front there just indicates that it's a composite that's actually used in a number of DDEX standards. Everything that's used in the ERN standard has an ERN colon prefix. Everything that's used in the, for example, radar notification standard has an RDRN prefix, and everything that's used abroad across the standards has a DDEX C for DDEX composite prefix. So at the top you see the name and if you like, the definitional scope of it, where is it used, and also where in the standard it's been used, in the new release message and in the purge release message in the ERN standard. And then you see that it's how it's been defined. It's a composite containing details of a role and instrumentation for which a party is credited. And again, you have hyperlinks there. So we could now look up what's a composite. We could look up what's a role. We could look up what's a party. We'll have a look at the role in a moment. But otherwise, I don't think there is point in following all of those links. And then last but not least, in the middle here, and that's the majority of the text, what you can see on the data dictionary, that's where all the definitions are being provided for all the individual elements, how they are used in the context of a specific composite. So the display credit text, it's the first thing in the sequence there. It's the textual portion of the display credit. Now, DDEX had to make a decision at one stage whether we define everything in one language or in multiple languages. We have decided to go with defining everything in English. So at the moment, at least, there is the data dictionary not available in any other languages than English. But that's yeah, that's just the nature of international business these days, isn't it? Now, Mark mentioned, and I kind of hinted at it, the fact that we have multiple editions of the DDEX Data Dictionary. We've just looked at the ERN edition of the Data Dictionary. Until the end of last year, we basically had one edition for each DDEX standard. So one for the ERN standard, one for the RIN standard, one for MEAD, one for the DSR standard, and so forth. So each standard had its own data dictionary, which contained all the tags that are used in that standard, including all the allowed value sets used in that standard, and it defined the syntax and the semantics in the way that I've shown it to you. So the syntax with the cardinality, as well as for each element, the definition that is being used there. For reasons I don't want to bore you with here, we've decided to change that approach. And going forward, we now have one edition for each standard, defining the syntax and the semantics of all the tags, and one separate edition that contains all the allowed value sets with their definitions. So has one drawback that if you want to understand the ERN standard fully, you need to look at the ERN edition and the allowed value set edition of the data dictionary. but it has the huge advantage that we have one edition that defines all the allowed value sets for all the different standards. That means that the allowed value sets for ERN that are used in the ERN message, for example, the use types defined in ERN and the use types defined in the DSR standard are always in sync because they're always going back to the same data dictionary. You may now ask, why do we provide one edition for each standard and rather than have one that defines the syntax for all of the standards? And that simply has something to do with the development cycle of the different standards, which are not really synced. It's not the case that DDEX publishes all its new standards in the summer or so, but each of the standards, ERN and DSR and radar and RIN and PI and MEAD, all of the funny, colorful lines that Mark showed you at the beginning, they all have their own development cycle. And during the development, we add the stuff into our internal representation of the overall data dictionary, because all of the editions are, of course, generated from one central ontology. So whenever we manage and maintain a standard, we add to the data dictionary, to the, for example, ERN portion of the data dictionary. But it's not being approved yet. We can't publish that bit. What hasn't been changed is when, I don't know, the DSR standard is finalized and being published, that's stable. So we can publish that bit, but we can't publish the ERN bit. And that's why we have to have different editions for each standard. It also has the benefit of not completely overwhelming people with so many tags that aren't actually used in a standard that they're interested in. So if you're interested in the ERN standard, you don't need to see the tags and the elements that are used in the, for example, RIN standard. But let me go back to the allowed value sets and give you an example. We all know, well, I assume we all know what an arranger is. For computers, again, as Mark said, it's just a series of strings. It's just ARRANGER. It has no inherent meaning whatsoever. And some people may call it arranger. Some people may call that concept arrangeur. Other people may call it people that reorganize music. And if that's the term you want to use in your local system, that's absolutely fine. But if I want to send you information about a party and tell you that that person actually needs to get money because he or she has actually rearranged some music, then I need to make sure that you and I have a common understanding of the semantics. That means that we need to have one term that we can both map to that expresses that semantics. And this is what we're doing with those allowed value sets. So here's a party and here is its role and we call it arranger. Now you know and I know exactly what that party has done with respect to the sound recording that we're talking about or the musical work that we're talking about. So let's go back to the contributor composite that I showed you a little bit earlier. And in there, you'll see the role code element. That's a composite containing details of a role played by the contributor. And here you see it's called role on the left-hand side in that composite, but the formal name of the composite itself that it's being used is called contributor role. The reason is because we have different sets of roles. We have musical work contributor roles and we have the more generic contributor role. So we have different role composites. We pick one here in the message and then we simply call it role because it's clear that it's a role of a contributor from the context. But again, it's a hyperlinked web page. If you click on role, you basically, or contributor role in this case, you go to the composite of that. And at the bottom, you again see that it's used in the contributor composite, in the detailed resource contributor composite, and in the display artist composite, and with the different labels that you have there. By the way, at the very far end, you see this further reading tab, which is mostly, I have to admit, empty at the moment. One of the things we are doing more and more is providing auxiliary articles on different composites, and you would then find a hyperlink in there that takes you to a further description of what this composite is being used for. For the contributor role, we haven't been able to author anything yet. But where do I see the allowed values? Well, at the very bottom, you see that the contributor role is actually a composite based on an allowed value set, which is visible by this AVS colon at the beginning. And that means you now need to traverse to and go to the allowed value set data dictionary edition. And if you go there, you see all the values that you have for the contributor role. This is just the first couple of entries. It's a list of, well, certainly 50 or so different roles that we have. And in the middle there, you have the arranger. It's a modifier of a musical components of a work. Note, the arranged musical work may or may not result in a new copyright creation. And you can also see that an arranger is a type of composer, and that there are certain specializations of an arranger. We have a music arranger, a sub-arranger, and a vocal arranger. Could there be other arrangers that we might want to add over time? Absolutely. And in that case, we simply add this to the role code, and the next edition of the allowed value set data dictionary will then include that further arranger type in here. I think it's hard to undersell the importance of the DDEX Data Dictionary. It does really define what I would call a lingua franca for the music industry, because it really allows people to map the semantics that you have in your own business operations, in your own software, map that to a central language so that you can then actually start to exchange information with people who use a completely different vocabulary in their own organization. And you can only do that by defining the semantics and the syntax of those composites as they are used across the different standards that we have. And just to give you a couple of numbers, there are around 5,000 message terms, as I would call them, so tags in the messages across the DDEX ecosystem. So that those are all those tags that you find in the message, plus a number of tags that then define fundamental concepts that are also necessary. 900 of those 5,000 terms are composites. The rest are simple elements. And 220 of those 5,000 are allowed value sets. And these then contain 6,500 allowed values across the board. Quite a number of them are territories. That immediately gives you 200 of them. And currencies, that gives you 200 of them. But then you have use types and instrument types and genres and all of those things. So at the moment, we're having 6,500 allowed values in the system. So that's quite a lot, I think you will find. Does that express everything that needs to be expressible in the music industry? Oh no, it doesn't. There is still lots that can be added and will be added over time, but it needs to be properly defined and then can be added to the data dictionary. So Massimo asked, where do you find this data dictionary? Well, this is the knowledge base that we have published, and on the knowledge base, And actually on all of the different standards landing pages, you find a data dictionary tab on the right-hand side. And there you can see the two editions that we have at the moment, which is the message edition for the recording data and rights notification standard, and then the allowed value set edition, which is currently only in version 1 because we've just started this new approach. And then you have the other editions. For example, you see the radar C data message structure and AVS data dictionaries that belong together. So we still list them there. We are about to publish in the next month or so 2 further standards. The MEAD standard will be updated to version 1.1, and the PI standard will be published as version 1.0 in a bit more than a month's time, hopefully. At that stage, you will see that there will be 3 message editions listed there, one for radar N, one for PI, one for MEAD. And then you will have, again, the allowed value set edition that applies to all of the standards. MEAD, by the way, is a standard to provide rich information about sound recordings, musical works, and releases. And PI is a standard to provide richer information about parties. Quite good. Quite a good set of 2 standards that kind of augment the ERN standards. No, Nathan, we do not have an instrument type brain in there at the moment, but it certainly is a very powerful instrument that I do give you. Anyway, this is what Mark and I had prepared to talk about. If there are any further questions, then please do let us know now in the chat or after the webinar, and we will try to reply by email, of course.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending this webinar. We hope you found it helpful. As I said, we are recording it, so it will be available from the resources tab of the main DDEX website, ddex.net, in the next day or 2. On the events tab of the website, you will find a list of the 2 remaining webinars that we've published so far for May and June. If you haven't already registered to attend those, please follow all the links and do that. And over the courses of the next 3 or 4 weeks, we will start to put together a further series for the second 6 months of the year. So please watch out for that as well. So
there's one question that just, sorry, Mark, that has
okay.
just come in from Massimo. Which is the meaning of the term choreography in this context? I don't actually. I think in the context of the data dictionary, choreography is not that important. The choreographies that we have defined and that we continue to define and manage and maintain defines basically who sends what message when. And the syntax and the semantics then define how that message looks like and what the message means that is being sent at a specific point in time defined by the choreography or established by the choreography. So choreography is one level up, if you like.
There is one other question about open source. There is quite a lot of open source available on GitHub. There is a DDEX page on GitHub, and in fact, they are listed on the knowledge base as well. We are not in a position to recommend any of them. We have no way of doing that, so I'm afraid we can't and won't make any recommendations. But you can certainly find the various bits of software on GitHub and see whether they meet any of your requirements.
One of the things that these software packages that I know of and that page on the knowledge base is a little bit outdated. It needs updating. But one thing that none of them do is actually provide a semantic mapping between what you may have in your system and the DDEX system. That is something that will still need to be done. You need to see that, well, this tag in the message containing the role code, that actually needs to go into this table in my local database because it has the equivalent meaning, or it may need to go into these 4 tags or columns in my table because together they have the meaning equivalent to the one of the message. So that is still a step that needs to be done to all of those tools that are available, open source or not. But yes,
Okay.
there is quite some open source material. Sorry, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Niels. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of whatever is left of your day, and hopefully we will see you soon at the next webinar. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.